The story begins on October 13, 1972, when a group of people was traveling from their country to Chile by plane for their final match. Everyone on board was extremely excited. For most of the players, it was their first time traveling by airplane, and it was also their first time visiting another country. Some of the players were even accompanied by family members who had come along to support them. After the plane took off and began its journey toward Chile, everything seemed peaceful. The passengers looked out through their windows and admired the breathtaking snow-covered mountains below them. None of them had any idea that, only a few minutes later, they would face something truly terrifying. After some time, the weather suddenly changed. A powerful snowstorm struck the plane, causing it to shake violently. Everyone on board became frightened. However, one of the passengers reassured the others, explaining that encountering turbulence while flying over mountains was normal and that there was nothing to worry about. The plane crashed into the mountain and broke apart. The front section of the aircraft slid down the mountain at tremendous speed before finally coming to a stop on a large snow-covered area. The impact was so violent that many of the seats inside the plane were crushed. Several people were killed instantly. The survivors slowly regained their senses and immediately began helping the injured people trapped inside the cabin. Some of the players tried to reach the pilots, but unfortunately, both pilots had already died. A total of 45 people had been traveling on the plane. After the crash, 18 people were dead, leaving 27 survivors. Because the crash had happened at night, darkness quickly surrounded them. The temperature outside was unbearably cold, and the survivors realized they could not survive for long in those conditions. To protect themselves from the freezing air, they used whatever they could find, including pieces of equipment and even the bodies of those who had died, to block the holes and openings in the broken aircraft. They then sat closely together in an attempt to preserve whatever body heat they had. Their situation was horrifying. They were still in shock and slowly began to realize that surviving in such a place would be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, somehow, they managed to survive through the night. When the sun finally rose the next morning, they discovered that 4 or more additional people had died from the extreme cold during the night. There was, however, one small piece of good news: the storm had finally stopped. When they stepped outside the wreckage, they could see nothing in every direction except endless white snow stretching as far as their eyes could reach. Now they understood that they could not remain in this place for long. If they wanted to survive, they would have to find a way out as quickly as possible. There were no houses, animals, or any kind of food source anywhere around them. At first, they removed the seats from inside the plane so everyone would have a place to sleep. They also placed the injured survivors in the sunlight to help warm their bodies. To get drinking water, they began melting snow and collecting it drop by drop. Some of the survivors also carried the bodies of those who had died away from the plane. They covered the bodies with snow so they would be preserved until help arrived and the families could take them away. As things became slightly calmer, they felt a little relief. But they were all extremely hungry. The small amount of food that had survived the crash was divided among everyone. They ate tiny portions, trying to make it last until the rescue teams arrived. Everyone believed the government knew about the crash and that rescuers would soon come to save them. But the reality was very different. The plane had crashed in a valley surrounded by enormous mountains, making the location incredibly difficult to reach. Suddenly, a plane flew over them. The survivors shouted as loudly as they could, desperately trying to make themselves noticed. But the aircraft was too far away and did not see them. A few hours later, darkness returned. They put on as many layers of clothing as they could and hid inside the wreckage. They used suitcases and other belongings to block the holes and keep the freezing air outside. The next morning, a man named Nando woke up. He had been unconscious since the crash and was badly injured. He could not even stand on his own feet. Still, he dragged himself forward until he reached his sister and hugged her. When he asked about his parents, he was told that both his mother and father had died in the crash. Hearing this, Nando was devastated. Meanwhile, the other survivors continued doing whatever they could to stay alive. They melted snow for water and drank it carefully. They also made a large X-shaped mark in the snow, hoping that any aircraft flying overhead would notice them. After some time, another plane appeared in the sky. But once again, the plane passed over them without noticing them. The survivors began discussing how they could escape from this isolated wilderness. Then they remembered something important. There were batteries somewhere in the rear section of the plane. If they could find those batteries, they might be able to power the aircraft's radio and use it to contact the outside world. Everyone agreed that it was worth trying. But putting the plan into action would not be easy. During the crash, the rear section of the aircraft had separated from the main body and fallen somewhere in the mountains. Nobody knew exactly where it had landed. Still, they decided to search for it. They prepared makeshift goggles using leather and pieces of glass to protect their eyes from the intense snow and sunlight. For members of the group volunteered to search for the batteries. They began walking through the endless snow. But after traveling some distance, they turned around and realized they could no longer see the wreckage of their plane. That was when they understood just how enormous and isolated this place really was. The plane had completely disappeared into the vast white landscape. Now they realized that nobody searching from the air would easily be able to see them either. This was probably why the rescue teams had failed to find them. Terrified by what they had discovered, the four men turned back and returned to the wreckage. 6 days passed. After about a week, all of their remaining food was gone. The entire area was covered in snow, and there were no animals or plants they could eat. They desperately needed to find something, anything, that could keep them alive. With no food left, they began eating a strange, muddy substance growing on the rocks. It tasted absolutely horrible. But they had no choice. Anything was better than dying from hunger. Before long, an even more horrifying discussion began among the survivors. Should they eat the bodies of those who had died, or should they simply starve to death? Some of them strongly opposed the idea. They believed it was wrong and feared that God would never forgive them for doing such a thing. But as the days passed, their hunger became unbearable. They became so desperate that they were forced to eat things such as their shoelaces and even cigarettes. But after going without real food for so many days, these things could not satisfy their hunger. A few more days passed. Eventually, one of the 6 survivors died because of starvation. The situation was becoming more desperate with every passing day. Nando had already lost both of his parents, and now he lost his sister as well. For nearly 9 days, the survivors had managed to keep themselves alive under these terrible conditions. But now, their hunger had become so severe that they could barely think clearly anymore. Death was right in front of them, and they had no other choice. They finally decided that they would have to eat the bodies of those who had died. At first, 4 people left the plane and began preparing the bodies. However, 5 survivors still refused to eat human flesh. They would rather die from hunger than do it. The next day, they began carrying the bodies to another location so that the 5 people who refused would not have to watch what they were doing. During this time, a young man named Numer found a suitcase buried beneath the snow. When they opened it, they discovered a radio inside. They switched it on, but there was no signal. Determined to make it work, they connected different objects together and created a makeshift antenna. Then, through the radio, they heard a news report. What they heard was devastating. The government had carried out numerous rescue missions to search for the missing passengers. But after all those efforts failed to locate them, the government had officially declared them dead. That meant the search had been stopped. Everyone lost hope. Whatever hope they still had of being rescued was completely shattered. Among the 5 people who had refused to eat the bodies, 4 of them finally began eating. They had realized that nobody was coming to save them. If they wanted to escape from this place, they would have to save themselves. 3 of the survivors decided to search for the rear section of the aircraft again. This time, they managed to find it. They discovered the batteries they had been looking for and decided to bring them back so they could use them to contact the outside world and prove that they were still alive. The 3 men began their journey toward the wreckage. After walking for hours, they finally found the scattered remains of the rear section and retrieved the batteries. But the journey had exhausted them. They had spent hours climbing through the mountains, while the freezing temperatures and powerful winds made every breath difficult. As darkness approached, they decided to take shelter behind a large rock and spend the night there. The next morning, they woke up almost completely covered in snow. Their condition was terrible. The cold was so intense that one of the men's eyes had become frozen shut. The other two could barely stand on their feet. They had almost no strength left to continue walking. So they came up with another idea. They sat on part of the aircraft's metal structure and used it like a sled, sliding down the mountain. When the others at the wreckage finally saw them returning, they were filled with relief and emotion. But the man who had been the last person refusing to eat human flesh had finally been forced to do it. After eating the flesh, he went to sleep while cursing his fate. Days continued to pass. The survivors had now managed to stay alive for 17 days. One day, while everyone was inside the wreckage trying to escape another storm, a massive avalanche suddenly struck the aircraft. Snow rushed inside and completely filled the interior. Unable to control his anger and emotions, Newmer began digging through the aircraft window. During the process, a sharp piece of broken glass became lodged in his leg. But he refused to stop. He continued digging despite the pain. After 2 exhausting days of digging, Newmer finally managed to create an opening leading to the surface, and everyone climbed out. They were incredibly happy to have escaped what felt like certain death. After celebrating their escape, they immediately began digging through the snow surrounding the aircraft to free the wreckage. During this process, Newmer realized that he could no longer feel the wound in his leg. The freezing snow had completely numbed the injury. Fortunately, the weather had begun to improve, so digging through the snow became much easier. Within a few hours, they had completely freed the aircraft. With the sun becoming warmer, they began thinking about searching for the rear section of the plane again. However, they still did not know how they would survive another freezing night in the mountains. Since summer was approaching and crossing the mountains would become much easier during warmer weather, they decided to wait a little longer. 34 days passed. By then, the weather had improved considerably. However, the men who had previously gone searching for the rear section of the aircraft were still in poor condition. They did not have enough strength to climb the mountains again. A few hours later, they received devastating news. After hearing this, they became deeply discouraged. They buried the body beneath the snow. 2 more days passed. The survivors finally realized that if they wanted to stay alive, they absolutely had to retrieve the batteries from the rear section of the aircraft and somehow contact the outside world. Otherwise, they would all eventually die. 4 men from the group volunteered to climb the mountains. Their names were Roberto, Tintin, Newmer, and Fernando. They put on as many layers of clothing as possible to protect themselves from the freezing temperatures and began their journey in search of the missing section of the aircraft. They traveled for hours, but they could not find it anywhere. Meanwhile, Newmer's health began deteriorating rapidly. He suddenly lost consciousness and collapsed. When the others saw that the wound on his leg had become badly infected, they decided that Newmer needed to return to the wreckage. But Newmer refused. He decided to make his way back down on his own and left before the others. Although he eventually managed to reach the aircraft, his condition was so bad that he collapsed again as soon as he arrived. After a short while, he regained consciousness and saw the others trying to clear the snow away from the wreckage. Meanwhile, the other 3 men continued their search for hours. Eventually, they found it. They discovered the rear section of the aircraft that had broken away when the plane crashed into the mountain. The 3 men were overjoyed and quickly approached the wreckage. When they searched inside, they found much more than the batteries. There were also plenty of clothes, bottles, and several packs of cigarettes. They gathered all the useful supplies and returned to the main wreckage. They connected the battery to the radio and tried desperately to contact the outside world. But unfortunately, the radio itself but others disagreed. They argued that if they stayed there, nobody might ever find them. They believed some of them had to travel on foot and find help themselves. By this point, Numer's illness had become extremely serious. He was taking his final breaths. Before he died, he told his friends, "If I die, all of you should eat me." After saying those words, Numer passed away. Later, they discovered a letter that Numer had written. In the letter, he explained that he was happy to have died among his friends. After reading Numer's final message, the survivors found new strength and determination. 3 men decided to begin another journey in search of help. This time, they carried enough food to survive the journey. Their plan was to cross the mountains somehow, reach Chile, and call for help for everyone who remained behind. They continued climbing without stopping. Eventually, they reached the top of one of the mountains. But when they looked down from the summit, their hopes almost disappeared. Mountain after mountain stretched out in front of them. They realized that they still had an enormous distance to travel. The 3 men did not have enough food to make it that far, so they decided to turn back. At that moment, Tintin made a difficult decision. He gave his food to the other 2 men so they would have a better chance of continuing the journey. Then he turned around and returned to the aircraft. The journey ahead was incredibly long and dangerous, but the other 2 refused to give up. They continued moving forward. Finally, after traveling almost continuously for 10 days, their determination began to pay off. They reached an area where the snow had become much thinner. Then they discovered something they had desperately needed for weeks. A clean flowing river. The 2 men drank as much fresh water as they could. And then something happened that neither of them could have imagined. On the other side of the river, they saw a man sitting on a horse. At first, they could not believe their eyes. They wondered if they were hallucinating. But after looking carefully, they realized that the man was real. Their happiness was beyond words. They desperately tried to get the man's attention and shouted for help. But the man was too far away, and the sound of the rushing river was too loud for him to hear them. So he threw a piece of paper and a pencil across the river and signaled for them to write down what they wanted to say. The survivors quickly wrote their message. Afterward, they washed their hands and faces and gathered their belongings. A rescue team soon arrived. 72 days after the plane crash, Roberto and Nando were finally rescued. The remaining survivors were taken back to the city. There, they were reunited with their families. The entire city welcomed them as heroes. They were then taken to a hospital, where they were cleaned up and given separate beds. But that night, despite having individual beds, they all chose to sleep together. The psychological trauma they had experienced during the disaster was so severe that they felt safer staying close to one another. In the end, we learned that out of the 45 people who had been aboard the plane, only 16 survived the ordeal. Their incredible story became a symbol of courage, determination, and the human will to survive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next movie.